Have you ever wondered why people believe in the weird and the supernatural? My guest today certainly has. Deborah Hyde, folklorist, skeptic, and former editor of the Skeptic magazine, has spent years unravelling the mysteries behind ghost stories, legends, and bizarre historical events. She credits her fascination with the supernatural to a childhood surrounded by mad aunties, and now applies psychology and history to understand why these tales endure. By day, she's worked behind the scenes in film and TV, even finding herself on the wrong side of the camera now and then. But by night, she's digging into the strange and supernatural with a rational eye. Today we're diving into one of the most peculiar medieval legends, the Green Children of Woolpit. Who were they? What do historical records tell us? And could there be a rational explanation for their eerie green skin? Stay tuned as Deborah's here to separate fact from folklore and explore what this story tells us about belief, history, and human nature. Hi Deborah, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hello, Michelle. Delighted to.
Do you want to start by just maybe explaining, first of all, what sparked your interest in folklore and superstition and all things supernatural?
It's been with me for as long as I can remember. I mean, since I was a kid. So it's one of those things. I think that if this is going to get you, it gets you very young. And my family on my mother's side were very much believers in all this stuff. They're very sort of mysterious old women. So I kind of started as a believer. You buy into all of this stuff. And I think it was because it was all about, it's about mystery and power. And those are very attractive things for a child because they don't have any power. And so it was just always fascinating. And the romance of castles and things like that. We didn't have much money, so we just used to go to old castles. And so the way that it all ties into history was really potent for me when I was a child. And I found a book called The Black Arts by a guy called Richard Cavendish when I was about 11. And it was the first time that it introduced me to the idea that the attempt at magic, I'm talking about high Renaissance magic here, was an attempt at understanding and manipulating the universe. It wasn't just a load of old nonsense sort of spewed mysteriously in the middle of the forest. This was people trying to understand the universe. And it went from there, really. I have to say, I wasn't allowed to read the Black Arts. I had to get on a chair and get the book and read it in quiet, because it's not the sort of thing that most 11-year-olds want to read. But it was a fascinating insight. And from there, I think the quality of my reading got better and better, because obviously you can spend your whole life buying into this. But I thought it was far more fascinating to read analysis, historical analysis of it. And so as time went on, by the time I was into my early 20s, I didn't believe in any of it, but I still found the subject very fascinating.
So as someone who is both a skeptic and a folklorist, how do you balance that appreciation for myths and legends with that rational approach to understanding them?
There are many folklorists who are also skeptics. I would say all of the decent ones, really. You've got to have a decent analytical brain on it, because otherwise, what are you going to believe? You're going to believe in everything. Werewolves, fairies, where do you stop? The thing that I think is so interesting about this subject, even if you are not religious or prone to belief at all, which I'm not now, it isn't about fairies and vampires. It's about humans. It's about the way that we construct our world. You can go into anthropology, you can go into history, you can go into literature, you can go into economies, the way that societies functioned under certain circumstances, to come up with these ideas that people constructed their universe with. So when I was younger, it was really not a very respectable line of investigation. I'm very good friends with Professor Chris French, Professor of Anomalistic Psychology at Goldsmiths University. And for him, it was the same, where he had his respectable strand of psychology studying. But if you were studying anomalous phenomena, that is what people subjectively experience when they see ghosts and things like that, then it was kind of like a little bit of a frivolous line. Dr. Susan Blackmore, who's done so much for out-of-body experiences and alternate experiences, the same thing. It's completely unrespectable when she was doing all of her work. And I think slowly over the last sort of 30 years or so, academia has come to realize that this isn't about fairies, this is about people.
And we're going to be talking about quite a well-known story, the Green Children of Woolpit. Do you want to just give a brief retelling of that story for anyone who is listening who's unfamiliar with it?
This happened in the 12th century. Most of the dating dates it to kind of the border of King Stephen and Henry II, which would put it in the 1150s. And there were two green children in Woolpit, which is in Suffolk, very flat part of the country. And they turned up at harvest time. They had come out from somewhere underground, either from the edge of a pit or literally from the underground world. And they couldn't speak English. Their clothes were made of a fabric that the people there couldn't understand. And they were green. That's the most peculiar thing. So they were taken to the house of a local nobleman, and they were offered food, but they didn't recognize any of it as edible. When somebody went past with some green beans, which at this point in history would have been broad beans, fava beans were the only ones that were in England at the time, they signed that they wanted to eat those. And they didn't seem to know how to get the beans out of pods. They tried to get them from the stalks at first. But once they got the beans out of the pods, they ate them voraciously, and that's all they would eat for a while. And eventually they started to eat our food, and they learned to speak English, or perhaps just the girl did, because the boy died. We don't know if he died before he learned to speak English or while he was still speaking a foreign language. And they recovered their colour, and she said about how she had come from an underground world. The accounts vary slightly. So the boy died, and the girl survived and went on to marry a man from King's Lynn, which is a bit further north. So you've got so many elements there, and it's obviously very, very peculiar. The most peculiar thing is the fact that they were green. How do you find people who are green?
Are there any historical records that exist that document this event? And how reliable are they?
Well, this is the thing that makes it so peculiar. I think we'd probably not talk about it that much, except that there are two independent chroniclers who write it down. There is Ralph of Coggeshall, and I was lucky enough to be able to go and see what remains of the Cistercian Abbey that he was abbot at. It's integrated into a house now, and there's one part of it that was probably there while he was there in the 1100s, the late 12th century. And he wrote a kind of, I think it was a slightly optimized view. He has slightly more mythological elements in, and he's a little bit more believing in this kind of thing. William of Newburgh, oh, and I should say, Coggeshall is in Essex, northern Essex. It's not that far from Woolpit. So Ralph attributes finding out about the story from a local nobleman, Richard de Calne, to whom the children were taken. So theoretically, this is just once removed, Ralph's account. And we also have another account from a guy called William of Newburgh, and he was based in an Augustan abbey, and he was further north in Yorkshire. So, and his account is a little bit more veridical. It's a little more down to earth. And he says it's very peculiar, but he's heard it from several people. So that's why he's giving it the time of day. That's why he believes in it. And it seems to be very much the kind of urban legend of its day. You know, it was one of those things. We're not the only people to transmit things virally. It seems as though people back then did as well. And of the internal evidence in the two accounts, the experts I've spoken to seem to think that they weren't kind of directly copying off each other. They were each having their own take on what was a viral story at the time.
So just thinking about then the local geography of Woolpit, is there anything that would challenge or contribute to the plausibility of this tale?
There are so many things that are interesting about this tale. The geography of Woolpit, it's in Suffolk, and the East Anglia, those low counties facing the continent, were in very close contact with the continent, with the Low Countries on the continent. So the idea that this was a bunch of gullible yokels who were making up some ridiculous fairy stories can be discounted, really, because East Anglia was in very close contact with Europe. There were educated people there. There were lots of people there. They did very well with the cloth trade from Flanders, and there were lots of foreigners living in the area. So it was a very cosmopolitan kind of area. That's the most interesting thing. This wasn't some little backwater somewhere at the top of the mountain. And the second thing is that both accounts give accounts of the children coming from below. William is a little more sober. He reckons that they were found near roof pits. These were ancient earthworks by the side of the village, sort of to the east of the village, that were intended allegedly to catch wolves. They've actually found Roman artifacts at Bushmobben, so we don't quite know what they're called, but they're very ancient pits. And Ralph explicitly has them coming from an underground world with caves and a sort of dark, sort of semi-sunlit world. And the interesting thing about Suffolk is that it doesn't have any caves, it's flat. So if you'd have been writing in Derbyshire about this, we could have said, okay, he's just buying into the local landscape. But he really is taking what is a very, very strong mythical element and putting it into this story in a geographical position where it doesn't really belong.
So just thinking broader, are there any other kind of known stories, either from England or elsewhere, that resemble this particular story of the Green Children of Woolpit?
There are a few, and for example, William of Newburgh writes about people rising from the dead. So you've got breaking a social contract. It's about a social violation, and he lived during a phase called the anarchy. The king had a daughter, Matilda, and he gave her the crown and said that she should be the next monarch. But a lot of people fought for her cousin, King Stephen. So we had King Stephen in the early 12th century. We had King Stephen, but it was a period called the Anarchy, and unlike some civil wars, it really did actually truly affect everyone. In the end, Matilda's son ended up becoming the next king, King Henry II, and he was one of our best ones, really. So William lived through a period of utter upheaval. It was awful, and the social norms were being violated. So it seems that he was writing some of these supernatural stories to illustrate that. But you've had others. I think it was Gerald of Wales wrote about a werewolf couple who were werewolves because of a curse, and woman needed the last rites before she died. So a priest went to give her last rites, and she took her wolf costume off, and then I think she zipped it back up again before she died or something. But in that case, it was a werewolf story, but it was as a result of a curse rather than a contact with the devil. So there were all sorts of stories like this. And you have to emphasize people weren't stupid. They did know the difference between reality and fable. They didn't have the same access to knowledge that we did, so they didn't know whether werewolves could be real, but it meant something in a literature sense. And they didn't know if there were other worlds under ours. I mean, there might have been. So they did try to tell the difference between reality and fable. And so we ended up getting a lot of stories, and we had to try and place them. Were they moral tales? Were they literal retellings of some factual accounts? Or were they meant to be fables?
So how then would you say that this story fits within the wider fairy folklore and medieval legends of that particular time frame?
Well, this is an interesting one because we might think that fairies are one thing, and really, if you trace the historical origins of them, there's over 1,000 years of literature and mythology there. And if you're not careful, you can try and compress them into one entity, and they just don't belong. One of the things that I've enjoyed most about doing my recent podcast is that I've got to speak to a couple of really good experts on this whole subject. There's John Clark has written about the Green Children of Woolpit specifically, and Francis Young has written about the origin of fairy folklore. So if you look at that, if you look at the podcast, you can see just how different our beliefs about fairies were in the 12th century to the way they were in perhaps the 6th century or the 16th century, indeed. Francis Young investigated the idea that fairies were an amalgam of all sorts of things, that they were the remains of Romano-British gods that remained after the retreat of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. And then after that, of course, you have Anglo-Saxons coming in, and for them, a more appropriate word was elves. You have these kind of powerful beings, but they're like tricksters. They were potentially very dangerous. You have the Norse elements coming in. So I think by the time Green Children of Woolpit happened, you've also got a big class difference. We have, for a while, people didn't keep records in local English. This was after the Norman Conquest. So you have an incoming of people from the continent, and all of the learned people are writing in Latin and speaking in Norman French. And they have a different culture, essentially, to the commoners underneath them. In addition, all of the stories that we get from commoners are through the filter of a different class. So people don't write things down firsthand. So we don't know what normal people thought about elemental spirits or spirits around them. But they come through these filters. Certainly the fairies that we have later on, the kind of fairies of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, are an amalgam of a great many traditions, including the romance and literary traditions of that Anglo-Norman elite. And the wings came a lot later. Probably the earliest you can find reference to fairy wings is sort of that would be 16th century, I suppose, but they got really popular in kind of 18th, 19th century. So if you're not careful, you can compress these very complicated and varied ideas into one and try to extract what you want from the Green Children of Woolpit, and it doesn't fit.
So what do you think then tales like this one can help us to understand and serve society today? You know, what can we learn from them? What's it still telling us about life in the 12th century?
I think what it tells us about our own stories is that urban legends and viral transmission of stories have been around for a long time, and that you don't get political accounts of factual events very well. You could have a camera and a microphone right there and then. People don't even remember them. Even if you ask two eyewitnesses to something, you ask them a year later, their accounts will probably vary. Or even worse than that, if they did vary initially, if they've spoken to each other, they'll conform because they've spoken to each other and formed new memories, in effect, from exchanging stories. So I think this can tell us that we're perpetuating stories, that the stories are there for a purpose, and that they will change according to who's telling them. As I say, William and Ralph were both educated higher class men because they were literate and they were churchmen, and they were talking about events that had happened to lower class people. So we don't know what they were taking from it. Life in the 12th century, it was very, very stratified, and so you would, we see that the green girl went to work in the household of Sir Richard de Cal. She was well said that she was still alive many years later, but that she was always wanton and impudent. And you didn't have to be particularly antisocial as a woman in the 12th century to attract that kind of label. She could have just been a bit assertive. Overall, I think it's just a very good insight onto the fact that people were trying to tell the difference between history and fable.
So, what are some of the leading theories then that attempt to explain this particular story?
Well, John Clarke goes through a lot of this in his book, and he takes each element individually, and I think you have to, because you can't necessarily just take the whole story at face value and try to put that into some kind of context into which it doesn't fit. The first thing to tackle, of course, is why were they green? I mean, it's a peculiar colour. And John Clarke goes through several of them. He was wondering whether or not it was because they had iron deficiency anemia, which can give you a sort of vaguely ill colour. He makes particular, he lays particular emphasis on the fact that Ralph at one point uses a word which kind of implies a very dark, bright green, rather than a green around the gills type thing. So we don't know what kind of green they were. But we do know that it disappeared, and we do know that both chroniclers attributed it to a change in diet. So they weren't looking for mysterious reasons. They thought it was that there was some kind of health issue which was fixed by better living. The theories about not recognising the language, that's a really peculiar one, because, as I say, this wasn't some gullible backwater. This was a very cultural part of the world. There were the recognised Norman French. The locals would have spoken various dialects of early English, Middle English. They would have recognised, the sounds of German. So the thought that there was a language which they just didn't get is really peculiar. It suggests that the children came from further afield, and one of the ideas that I'm examining in the podcast series is that they really came from far afield, that they were perhaps Jewish or Muslim, they'd come from the Middle East somewhere. So we don't really, the point is we don't actually know. You can't tie this one up nicely into a little parcel. But you can say that it's an interesting insight onto 12th century life.
Yeah, and I think it's partly the mystery that makes it so enduring, isn't it? It's such an interesting aspect. The fact that here you have an account with children who have this green pallor to their skin, and yeah, the fact that you can't tie it really neatly together in a bow and have the answers so easily there to explain it all. There are so many different possibilities that make it so fascinating and intriguing. And like you said, it just allows us to have this lens into a particular part of the world at a particular time and the people within it and the stories that they are telling. It's fascinating.
Yes, I think that's the value of it. There's the romantic fairy story element. There's the idea that you're going into a past world. There are the ideas that people are coming from underground as well. I mean, there's a lot of British folklore to suggest that, in fact, Catherine Briggs, who was a great student of fairy folklore, suggested that this was somehow kind of a reference to ancient religion and relationships with the dead. Most people have had some kind of supernatural relationship with the dead, because it's very, very difficult to believe that someone has simply gone just because they've stopped breathing. I mean, when you love someone and they just pass and there's still a body there, that's incredibly hard to believe they've just gone. And relationships with the dead feature so heavily in so much religion that it would be a miracle if it hadn't happened in Britain as well. That certainly, there were barrows built for and earthworks built kind of 3,000 or so years BC, a little bit more than that. And these were certainly rather mysterious to later people. For example, we've got where there's smithy on the Ridgeway. That's very, very old earthwork. And it was called Wayland Smithy because Wayland was a Germanic blacksmith, kind of a mythological figure. So we've got people who we would think of as highly historical have taken something which is more historical still and integrated into their own folklore and their own legends. I did some filming in Ireland a couple of years ago, and there are these what they call fairy forts there. And these were very practical things. These were earthworks. You would have a circular earthwork. You would dig a ditch because the best way to stop someone raiding you was to have a fence and to have a body of water to pass across. But people much later on called them fairy forts and thought that this was a sort of a supernatural place where fairies gathered. So we're not the only people to be projecting backwards onto what we see in the landscape and to try and make something mythological of it. It turns out that an awful lot of people have done it. And the Green Children, well, part of their story is that they may well have come from underground, which kind of speaks of fairyland and relations with the dead.
And for me, this is one of the really fascinating aspects of exploring folklore, exploring history, exploring these kind of elements of the supernatural that kind of bleed through in storytelling, because it speaks so much to belief systems and how humans interpret the unknown. And I think we tend to look back on history and we look at individuals and groups of people at certain points in time and think, how can someone possibly think this? And how can this story be something that was believed and so on and so forth? But for me, I think it shows this connection between our past and ourselves today, because I think we still do the same thing. We make stories, we tell stories, we try and shape and understand things that are not known to us. As human beings, we don't like to be in the dark, to not have the answer. And so here you have people trying to create answers, trying to bring together rational answers, to explain, to hypothesize and come up with systems that explain something that they can't, that they don't necessarily have the answers to within their own town, landscape, culture. Here is something to fill that void. And I think that's incredibly invaluable to explore, because I think, as I say, I think it connects us to our past, but at the same time, it helps us to truly understand what people were thinking and feeling and what their day-to-day life was like, what it was that for them were their concerns of the day. And again, we can often see that there are similarities rather than differences.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, people aren't stupid, so they might come up with some really funky ideas, but they do the best with what they've got. And the second thing is that there's anything more important than knowing your past, and that is to be able to predict the future, because people in the past live a lot more on the edge than we do. I don't know about you, but I've got a cupboard full of food downstairs. That's virtually unknown in history, and quite unknown in a lot of the world today. So we have to remember that people needed some sort of power over the world, and that included over a supernatural world as well. And so these models of the world kind of emerged partly from the way that our perceptual systems work, and our perceptual systems produce a lot of errors. They're built for survival, not reality. And in addition, because we're naturally storytelling creatures, we do the best with what we've got, and it's good to be able to try and hold on to an idea of the world to see if you can fix it.
So we've obviously spoken about this story and some of the theories around it. What is it that you particularly think, for yourself happened here? Do you think this actually happened as a starting point?
I definitely think something happened, yes. And I think that the story, the kind of dynamics of urban legend and creepypasta have got a lot to contribute to this, because we can see that the stories are different in their different retellings. William of Newburgh was very keen to place it in reality, although he was puzzled about how it could be true. Ralph of Coggeshall was a bit unashamed about putting the more legendary elements in as well. But they both definitely thought it had happened. Ralph of Coggeshall, bear in mind, had heard it just once removed from Sir William de Calne, who had spoken to the children and in whose household the girl worked for many years. So I definitely think something happened. A couple of children were abandoned. They certainly had a peaky colour, and it was a colour that shocked people there at the time. So they definitely attributed it to a nutritional deficiency, because both writers attribute the change in colour to a more healthy colour through food. And it's hard to say what the language they were speaking and the cloth they were wearing were, because, as I say, this was a very well-travelled part of the world. This wasn't some backwater. So the thing about this story, which makes it so appealing for folklorists and for skeptics and all the people who want to hear about it, is that we can't quite know. I think we've had writers who've tried to really reduce it down to its facts, and it just doesn't quite get there. Paul Harris had it down to a couple of children lost from cloth merchants from Flanders after their parents were killed. And it kind of doesn't quite work, but I really admire his ability to try and truly get down to the facts. John Clarke has done the definitive version. The fact is, we can't know, but personally, I am sure that something happened and that it was remarkable enough to bother writing down.
So, Deborah, just to kind of look ahead, where can people find more of your work and follow along to discover more of what you're doing?
Well, if you type in Deborah Hyde to Google, you'll probably find me fairly easily. I'm on all of the socials. And I've just started doing a recent series of videos. I'm trying to do one a month. There are probably 5 or 6 episodes on the Green Children of Woolpit. So you can find me through the socials, and then you'll be able to follow what I'm doing after that. I'm out there and I'm easy to get.
And I will make sure, of course, to include all of those links so that if people want to follow up by, coming and finding you on Instagram or finding your website or listening to your podcast, etc., I will make sure that links to all are available so that, if you're looking at this via the website, there'll be those direct links there, and likewise in the podcast description notes. So yeah, I encourage people to follow up, because you cover so many really, truly interesting aspects that, yeah, I think it's a fascinating one to follow up with, because, as I say, there are so many things that you cover, so many topics of interest there that I think you dive into to give your approach and share your expertise and your research with.
The gift that keeps giving, really. I can't imagine ever running out of source material. And it's really, really good to meet people and to talk to them, at events, when I do live events and that kind of thing, because I think so many people are into this stuff, and it's just nice to be able to provide them with content that keeps them happy, keeps them stimulated. It's great.
And just to kind of follow on from that, are there any books, articles, talks that you might recommend for anybody listening who, again, if they're wanting to follow up and look into this particular story a little bit further, where would be some good places to maybe signpost them to?
For this particular story, I would say the definitive book has been written by a guy called John Clarke, and it's called Green Children of Woolpit. There was also a really good article written by a guy called Paul Harris, and he tries to take a very practical kind of analysis of the Green Children of Woolpit. I think it falls down on a couple of practical issues, but his approach is really good. If you're interested in the origins of fairies, Dr. Francis Young wrote The Twilight of the Godlings, and I've got all of these credits on any of the YouTube videos, because Francis and John both appear in those videos giving interviews. If you're interested in general about fairies, then there are so many books to read. You can't do worse than starting with Catherine Briggs. the fairies in tradition and literature. So she sort of started off, I think, she was one of the people in the mid 20th century who started off the whole respectable study of fairies. So yeah, there's loads of stuff out there, and I give links underneath the video, so just pop over there.
Thank you so much again for your time. Honestly, it's been so fascinating to talk to you. If I could, I would start going into other areas, and we could start talking werewolves and witches and magic and all the other things that keep me so avidly interested in what you share across your social
For another
pages and things.
time.
Yeah, honestly, the door's always open. I think we could literally spend the next 100 years talking folklore and these kinds of accounts, and yeah, they fascinate me. So, yes, thank you so much for your time. Just to be able to talk this one particular account has been really, really interesting for me to get your perspective. So, thank you so much for your time, Deborah.
Well, thank you for having me on.
And I will say goodbye to everybody listening. Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. You can follow us on social media for updates and more intriguing stories. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious.